Annyeonghaseyo! Welcome to Afternoona Delight, where Leah, Megan, and Amy, romance novelists, and your K-romance guides. So grab some dekboki and listen to your new favorite unease.
All right. Hey, everybody. Today is a very special episode because we have a special guest today. And when I say we, I mean me, because Megan and Amy are not here today. But we have a friend of the pod who has not been a guest before yet. And I'm really excited to have her today. So welcome to Susan Lee. Hello.
Hi, Leah. Thank you very much for that lovely welcome message. I'm sad that I'll be missing Amy and Megan, but hopefully I'll be able to catch up with them in the future. It's great to be here.
So this is going to be kind of more of an uncensored type of episode. It's a little bit of a structured casual chat that kind of came about because Susan is somebody that I end up talking to a lot online. And I think is really interesting and super smart and always has really good perspectives. And so, yeah, I had said, I would love to have her on as a special guest. We did have this gap where Megan and Amy were really busy. And so I kind of took my opportunity. I stopped my shot to get Susan to come on. So first, before we get into kind of where we're going to go, which is going to be, I think, a fun conversation about romance novels, Korean dramas. Let's get into just normally we have like a little bit of a banter at the start of every episode. So I'm going to rope you into that. And we're not going to spend a lot of time with this, but we've been connecting more lately on, I think, a subject that for some of you, you're going to be familiar with. And for some of you, you're going to be like, Leah, please stop. I just don't care anymore. But we're going to just generally talk about it. And that is BTS and a little bit more of kind of like the dramas that have been happening since early August. So Susan's been like one person that I've been chatting with online on the regular about these topics.
I would say we're sort of a 2% support group for each other right now.
Yeah, I would say so. We trade articles, we trade views, we keep things off the general timelines because we don't want to like really take things into like general spaces and social media. So we'd end up like kind of like backdoor chatting, which is probably personally, I think, for the best in many things like this. It's just better to have people to talk to behind the scenes.
I agree. And as I said, like, I think the support for me personally anyway, has been invaluable because I think with everything else that's going on in the world already as it is, this is just adding to another exhausting aspect to the life that we're all living right now. So just to have the validation and to be able to support each other's ability to share our views, I think is very helpful. But also it makes me feel a little less like I'm just screaming into the void. So
yeah. So thank you for that too. And I think that like you just alluded to, the world is never easy. I mean, like, I don't buy into this thing of like, oh, the good old days. Like, what good old day? Like the good old days were right. So there's always very good, beautiful things happening. And there's also always like diabolical, hard, difficult things happening. And I think for me, I'll speak for me personally, then I'm going to let you kind of like express, because I don't want to speak for you. For me personally, coming into K-drama during the pandemic was no accident. Like, to me, that was like a very lucky escape that I got to have, that kind of like called to like my like better self. Like, I like to think about hope and joy, and it made me more excited about the romantic genre again. It brought me back to writing again. So I find that to be like, that's like a protected, happy space. And kind of the BTS space also became something that I built a lot of friends through the fandom. I have a lot of respect for members. It's been like a happy place. So to see kind of like ick in the world kind of like encroach upon it also just feels like jarring and just like sucky. I have no smart way to say that, because we're kind of up against like so many difficult topics all the time that like it is nice to have places of like respite to kind of just like think about hope and be happy and have fun.
same for me as well, except that my experience with having the safe haven and outlet of K-dramas and K-pop started a little bit prior to the pandemic. I actually had lost touch with my Korean culture background for quite a bit, because I went through a phase where I thought oh, I want to be a new waver and I want to listen to New Order all the time and The Cure. And, we all go through those phases, right? Where we take on the identity. And then it was grunge. And then after a period, I realized that it wouldn't hurt to reconnect with my culture. And so when I began to do that, I realized that there is space in my life for both, as well as world music. I started discovering a lot of different world music, specifically around that time as well. So that this would be like early to mid 2000s. But the actual first K-drama I sat down and watched all the way through was Winter Sonata. And that kind of traumatized me a little bit. I don't know if you got to see it yet, but it traumatized me a little bit.
So we have started a list of dramas that are kind of regarded as like classics, basically just like slightly older dramas, and that is on the list to watch. So now I'm nervous.
No, I mean traumatized in a good sense, and in that it was so dramatic. But I did take a little break because that was so emotional, like up and down, and like it felt more of like an experience than an emotional outlet. So I had taken a break and gone into Full House, which is light, and I'm sure you've seen it. It's light and fluffy. And then from that point, it's just been a deep dive back into the Korean culture. And when BTS came around, like you, it became a safe haven for me in that it's something I enjoy and it's fun, and their music, and their lyrics, and even the personal lives, at least what we're seeing, that's presented to us by the seven guys, like it made me feel like there was light at the end of the tunnel, especially during some of the darker moments, not just the pandemic, but election cycles and whatnot. We won't go into political things here, but all that to say that I felt like they were there to help a lot of people, and same with K-dramas as well. But I think the difference for me in recent months, I think, has been that because of social media, everything feels a lot more, not just amplified, but in your face. If that makes sense. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because in the past, you had your outlets, you had your hobbies, whatnot, but even if you were able to find others that you can connect to, it was still just in that space. But with all the things, the controversies that are happening in the world, but especially with the current situation, I just feel like it's so immediate and everything happens so quickly. You and I have talked about that. Like, there are developments literally every minute.
Yeah, I think so. One thing that's been interesting for me in this, I have so everything you're saying makes me want to ask other questions too about you. So we're going to get to that. But I think for me, one thing that happened was, especially when we started to deal with the scooter incident that we've talked about, where the BTS member Suga fell off of his electric scooter, had tested as being over the legal drinking limit, and that kind of spurred this uproar that became very quickly almost cartoonishly bad. Within at first when it happened, I was like, people were laughing. Honestly, people in the US and many places in the West were making kind of jokes about it. I didn't, because I immediately was like, this feels like it could be hurtful or bad. But I still was so naive that I didn't realize where it was going to go. And I think I realized really quickly, probably 24 hours, 48 hours into this news cycle, when there started to be these ideas that oh, the fans are doing this so-called Suga challenge. And it was people are driving drunk and posting it on social media to be in solidarity with Suga. And I was like, well, obviously that's a cart, that's clearly not real. But why is the news, I was so confused at first. I was like, why would the news be covering this like it's real? Because even people were able to go on Pinterest and find the photos that people were pretending were photos of them driving and stuff. People found it within 10 minutes. It was just, I was very, very innocent and confused as to how this was being reported, and not by tabloids, but by quote unquote serious news channels. And I was like, but that's not real. Anyone looks at that and you're like, obviously that's fake. Why are they covering it like it's real? And then I just realized that we were walking through a door that that feels triggering for me. I mean, triggering is a funny word, but feels triggering for me in the sense that like we have been living in, like, we're both in America right now. We've been watching our media kind of on like a slope of like, you know, sensationalist fake news. And it's become, and it's discouraging. And I feel like it's like, it's very dangerous because we need media, because media is like a good checks and balance to like the powers that be. And so seeing all of a sudden to be like, whoa, like that's real bad. And of course, like if people like who like are in Korea all the time, I'd be like, yeah, we have a lot of problems with our media. I think for me, it was like one of the first steps in to be like, oh shit, like there's so much here. Like I've never pretended to be like an expert in like Korean culture. I'm still like very like new to drama. Like, you know, in the last couple of years, I've started to like engage in Korean entertainment. That doesn't make me at all an expert in anything. But it did really wake me up in the last 6 weeks to be like, whoa, there's a lot of like problematic parts of their media. And that's not to say that other countries don't have problematic media. Of course they do. I've just been very fixated on this problematic segment of the media because boy, oh boy, is it multi-layered.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of media and culture. I think I mentioned this to you in prior conversations. I think that one of the elements that's feeding the fire is this level of let's protect what is public. But then the competing aspect of that, which is let's unearth everything, including the dirty socks that's hidden in the corner of someone's closet. You know, I'm going to say something that may not be popular with some people. But I'm going to say it anyway. I think that there is voyeurism that exists in every culture. And I think what's happening now is voyeurism of Korea generally, partly because of how quickly K culture shot up in popularity in the past 15 years with streaming being available and so forth. Not just the socials, but also streaming. I think there's a certain level of schadenfreude that exists out in the non-Korean world. And so I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it too is that I think with fake news and sensationalizing tabloids and so forth, yes, that exists everywhere. But I think it's interesting that there are a couple conglomerates that are mostly responsible for the worst offenses with sensationalism. The biggest, most tragic example being Princess Diana. And there are few people who are managing or pulling the puppet strings of all of this. And this is why I'm saying it may not be popular. I don't know who's actually controlling, who's at the controls in Korea right now with the media.
Yeah, but it definitely has felt, and we've seen even just like in this year, we've seen huge tragedy and huge artistic loss coming because of honestly just irresponsible media. That has led to, you know, the death of Lee Sung-kyun, which is, I don't want to like harp on it and like and use his tragic death as like some sort of like got you. I just feel like it was incredibly sad. And when you just see the relentlessness of the attacks of the media, it definitely feels as if like what is responsible and what is not. And I mean, and that's, we can talk about that with like, you know, you alluded to Princess Diana too. Like there's times where we have human beings and it's like, what are people meant to bear? And I think that's kind of like tied into like what we've been talking about lately. Like lately seeing that come up again, it feels familiar again of just like that icky feeling of like, what are people meant to bear when they are a celebrity, and what are they meant to like, the dehumanizing part of it, I think gets really tricky.
And I think that's where the voyeuristic aspect of this comes in. I think that because Lee Sung-kyun he had become a global star. I think that made him more vulnerable to that kind of scrutiny. Certainly with BTS, that's the case. And some of the other K-pop and K-drama idols and celebrities, I think that is a factor that we can't necessarily discount. But I think that one of the things that I'm finding a little distressing is that there doesn't seem to be as much of a dialogue as I wish that there could be between. I'll speak specifically to the armies, BTS armies. I feel like there is an artificial divide that's being created between I armies and K armies.
So I armies, I'm just going to speak to anyone.
Sorry. I'm speaking BTS.
Like international. I'd say there's like international army, U.S. Army is almost its own thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Army, and then there's Korean Army or K Army.
That's true. That's true. Thank you. I'm speaking BTS speak. But there is this divide that people are constructing artificially, and there isn't as much conversation going on in between the different fandoms. And yes, super fandoms are always, I think, very intense. There's the Taylor Swift fandom, the Lady Gaga fandom. Every fandom goes through its thing, but I feel like this is almost like 3 different fandoms within the same thing. And again, going back to the voyeuristic nature of what's happening right now, and I'll try to wrap up my tangential thought with this. I think that we're all going to get to a point within the next couple of weeks where we hopefully will see what's actually happening behind the scenes. And I'm hoping that all the different aspects of the fandom can come back together and say, you know what, let's look just forward. Let's look forward and let's look toward the future. Let's anticipate 2025 and then just move on.
Well, I think what you're saying, thank you for that. And I think it's a good segue into like the broader conversation, because you sit at like a pretty interesting nexus. And, there's other folks who kind of have like your experiences too of being, kind of understanding 2 cultures at once. And so, can you talk to us just a little bit about like your own like as much as you feel comfortable in sharing, of course, like your own kind of like personal like migration story a little bit, because I think it kind of helps set the context for kind of a bigger chat on what we're going to unpack today.
Sure. I would love to share my story actually, because I'm sure there are a lot of others out there who have a similar experience to mine. My family moved from Korea. We chose to leave to go to South America, British Guyana in South America. I won't say when, because then that will really date me. Okay. Because my parents wanted a less stressful and less anxiety-filled existence for us kids. And the plan was always to land here in the US. But one of the things that my parents could never have known when they took us out of Korea is that being an Asian American in a foreign country has its challenges. In Guyana, it was the type of challenge of the people in my school and my brother's schools thinking that we were North Korean. So that was interesting. And it didn't matter how many times I insisted that we were not from the North. Nothing against people who are from the North, but they just never understood. So there was back then, there was a lack of education and awareness about the actual history of Korea and the then existing conditions between the 2 countries, the relations. And then when just a few years after that, we landed here in the US, I landed in a very, very alien and foreign culture called South Jersey.
Okay.
And my family traveled all over the world, and this is not meant as a disparagement of Jersey at all, because I lived there for several years before I moved away. It's its own unique culture, and it's very insular, or was back then. And so as a result, I experienced a lot of bullying, and my escape from bullying was books. And the biggest escape for me at the time was because I was lacking the kind of interactions that I was craving. You know what I'm going to say? Romance books became the big thing for me, because I was like, why can't I just have a group of friends like the ones that they write about in these romance books, like a group of, 3, 4 girlfriends, whatever, and they all each have their own romances. Now, to be fair, I probably should not have been reading some of these romance novels when I was 13, 14, even 15 years old. But look, I needed a way to take a crash course in how to assimilate with a cliquey nature of American high school culture. And
so I just want to do a couple of clarifications, and I'm not asking you to date yourself or anything. So when you moved to South Jersey, you were like entering into kind of like your young teen years. Is that?
Exactly. I was just entering, I was finishing up 8th grade, and because my father had some health issues, I ended up finishing 8th grade pretty much on my own. And then I didn't start school again until freshman year of high school. And as we know that in most American school systems, by the time you reach high school, everyone knows each other. Like they've gone through at the very least middle school together, if not elementary and middle school, and then high school. So I really didn't know anyone. And that probably was a factor.
Did you have any language hurdles at that point, or had that been kind of like because you had said that you'd had like other stops along the way of like your migration?
And that's actually a great question. Actually, when we were in British Guyana, I learned, I didn't know I didn't even know the English alphabet when we landed. I was still in grade school at the time. And so at the same time that I learned English, I also learned French and Spanish as well.
Wow. So you speak 4 languages.
Okay. Now I currently speak 3.5.
Okay.
Kind of ish. But the interesting thing is, we were going to an international school when we were living in Guyana. So I just developed an American accent pretty quickly. And so when we landed in Jersey, the only difference between my accent and theirs was that they spoke with a Jersey accent, and I sounded like I was from the Chicago area.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. So you kind of got more of like that, like I would say like
Western California kind of.
So would you say like the Midwest, this is like me just like, I am generalizing here, but I'm not trying to do it from like a point of disrespect. Like when they talk about like the Seoul accent being kind of like the standardized accent for South Korea, would you say like the Midwestern accent, like, is it similar in that? Because I feel like we have like a standardized, like what like the newscasters are striving for. Like there's kind of like because when I was little, I used to consider it unaccented, but now I'm like, no, of course it's accented. It's just like the agreed upon.
It's a different accent. Yeah.
When I was younger, I was like, oh, that's like everyone else in the US. And I was thinking about it from like a US context. I'm like, the rest of the US speaks an accent.
Yeah.
I don't, because like my accent is like in the Midwest, and we have this like, I mean, I was a child, but like that was kind of like the way that I would think about it, which is wrong, but funny.
I wouldn't. So it's funny. I had the Midwestern accent. Well, it was sort of like a hodgepodge of Midwestern / California accent. And the feedback I got, or feedback's not the right word. It's more like uninvited commentary that I got when we landed in South Jersey, because everyone said water and tomato and that very Jersey accent was, oh, you don't really have an accent, but you speak different. I can't figure out what it is. And they just assumed it was because I was Asian, because they couldn't really process that I didn't have a foreign accent. So I got that feedback. I mean, I did get the odd, oh, how do you speak English so fluently? And I'm like,
yeah.
So I won't comment on that. But to your point, I would say language wise, there wasn't a barrier, but I did have a barrier with the teachers. They just because I wasn't from this country, they automatically put me in ESL.
Oh, wow.
Which was interesting because I placed in the honors and AP English classes, but they put me in ESL. So it's like, which is it?
Yeah. Well, it's racism.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
Wow.
But yeah, I think that the interesting thing about that phase of my life is that I didn't have the colloquialism that I probably would have needed in order to not be picked on.
Yeah.
So it wasn't because of a language thing. It was because I didn't know the slang. if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense to me. And what's interesting, and so I have a very, very obviously different upbringing to you and totally different experiences, but there's something odd that we kind of overlap on here. And it's about kind of the timing. And so I'm just gonna like give it in a nutshell. So I grew up in like I was raised in rural southeastern Michigan until I was in 5th grade. My mom's family had like migrated there in like the 1840s, like long time standing like Southeast Michigan family.
Wow.
So my dad got a job transfer to Milan, Italy. So we moved to Italy when I was in 6th grade, and we lived there until halfway through my 7th grade year. And then we moved back to Southeast Michigan because my grandma had died. And there were like lots of reasons we moved back, but we ended up landing there around the time my grandma died, and we had to spend some time where my parents were like dealing with her house and her estate and things. So I ended up going to a school maybe 2 small farm towns away from like where I had grown up. And coming in and then basically being like, Leah's here, she's just moved here from Italy. Like the othering that happened, even though I was like, yo, I've been gone like a year and a half. Like I am from like a town, like this, like, we play each other in football. Like we're a tiny towns. The othering that happened was wild. And I'm not trying to like hold it to say that like I experienced anything like you did, but to just say that like it was so odd. And what I ended up doing, because I had no friends, I was completely bullied, I was completely ostracized, was I read romance novels at school. I would just bring them to study. Yeah. And so I escaped. And so it's just a funny thing to say that like I did it because I would like be at my aunt's house. Like I have a huge extended family. And so I would just go to like my auntie's houses, and they would just have like paperbacks and paperbacks. Like my mom didn't have them, but like people in my family did. And I would just come through like a little steely poacher and grab those. And then I would grab like my great uncle's cigarettes because I was like a bad girl. I was like, I'm going to be a bad girl too, and take these like 3 old Newport cigarettes from my great uncle. And yeah, that was like how I was like living my life for 7th and 8th grade. And honestly, that's what I did. Like at lunch, I would go to the library, I'd go in the bathroom and I would read, or in study hall, I would read when like people were like throwing stuff at me. But the bullying happened mostly because of this idea that I was like so different, even though like I truly was like the whitest, most cult. Like I was like, our families are probably related in some way. Like we're all from the same spot, but just the fact that there was like this like whiff of difference, and being like, you just moved here from Italy, it just opened up this random, very strange door to bullying. But romance again became like my, and I was reading like the romance of the, I mean, this is like the 90s, but I was reading romance of kind of like the late 80s and 90s, probably some into like the early, like, I was just grabbing whatever I could. But there was a lot of problematic content then that like, like it was the era of like the rape to love you.
Oh,
With like non-consent was like because you were like a girl would never consent. She would be like taken and then all of a sudden be overcome by her feelings. And that led to the happy end. I mean, like there was all sorts of wildness that was happening then. That's always interesting in romance to be like, why is that the way? But in many ways it was because we were still in that era of, I guess, like you don't ask for what you want. A man will give you what you need.
as horrible as that is, to hear it again, that actually was what I experienced. And the interesting thing for me is that I read everything. I just read voraciously. I was reading, I don't know, like 10 to 20 books a week or something like that. And it wasn't just romance books, but ironically, there's that same kind of thread in literature as well, right? Like some of the Bronte sisters wrote about that. And, that same kind of like women can't ask for what they want. They can't live their own lives.
And Heathcliff.
Oh, good Lord. I knew that was going to come up.
It's one of the, I mean, like I'm a Jane Eyre, like I love Jane Eyre. And I mean, look, I think as I've gotten older, I've gotten more like, I used to be like, it's okay that Mr. Rochester is so problematic. And now I'm like a little bit more like, yeah, probably not. I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to be like, but I've just like become less enamored with that idea of like the Byronic heroes that are just like, I'm so intense, you could never understand my pain.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's my BTS era, is like finding like, I'm like, no, actually I want like emotional men who, give at least give the portrayal of like being connected and feeling and like gentle.
And not just men, right? Just being authentic, I think is the key. And that's what I was missing in my own personal life. And as a result, I looked for the really contrived and fake existence of romance novels as a way to understand American culture. I think that was, to me, that was the biggest missing link, that when we landed here, MTV had just, oh gosh, now I am dating myself. MTV had just really become
up and going
ubiquitous in most teen households. And so there still wasn't, there not having been socials or even the internet back in the day, there was no other way for me to consume Americana.
Mm-hmm.
So romance books ended up becoming the quickest way for me to learn. I mean, it was literally an anthropological thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like you, I read a lot of problematic content. And one of the ones that I'd mentioned to you previously was a series by Jackie Collins.
Okay.
And I think by today's standards, I don't know what she would think, but they were not the most feminist books.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say that. So I recognized that with the romance novels, and yet I was still consuming them like, I don't know, one a day and a half. I mean, like I was consuming romance novels like it was one a day multivitamins.
Yeah. Because
they were also quick reads too.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing to me about the romance novels is that I think back in around the same time that you were reading them, the modern fiction of that era, I feel like, was very male dominated still. Mm-hmm. And a lot of, like, I didn't relate to a lot of them. There weren't as many prominent women authors. Erica Jung is probably the exception. Mm-hmm. Again, even with her books, she wasn't romance, but she also had very adult themes. Mm-hmm. And I was reading Erica Jung's books when I was like a sophomore in high school. Mm-hmm. Like Fear of Flying and, some of her books from that era are very, what was it? Someone said she was the female Henry Miller, if that can give a little bit of context. So yeah, I mean, that was sort of how I experienced my formative years. My head buried in romance books.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I'm still gonna always say romance is an amazing genre, and if anything, I think that like what I've become like even then, I think it was like the beginning of trying to have that like female gaze and that agency, even if it was still like heavily dominated by like the patriarchal aspects. And I feel like as we get like, if you look at romance today, it very much is becoming like more and more subversive. I think that's why I'm like always excited by it, because you're seeing people who often society is deeming as like just not allowing spaces for joy and not allowing like narratives that like celebrate that. And so like to see, like the rise of like Kennedy Ryan and this idea of like Black joy and love, and having that be like, you're going to get a TV series out of it. And, that like that upswelling of popularity of like, yes, we want to see like people from all sorts of different identities and all sorts of different like ethnicities be able to kind of step into the place that like they're valid and deserving of love and desire and all like the full form of human expression. So I think that is really like an exciting trajectory right now that we're on in romance. But I think switching gears a little bit then into like the drama space for you, it's like you were saying that like you started watching dramas, like Winter Sonata is still like an older drama, but it's not like, it doesn't sound like you grew up necessarily watching dramas. Like, that's still like a relatively like in the span of things, it's not that old.
Okay.
Well, I'm just saying that like was your family watching were dramas like part of like your childhood in any way?
So I was actually it's interesting why you were talking about romance novels having been one of the few genres of female voices and female gazes. That's one of the things that I was thinking about with reference to or in connection to Korean dramas. My mom was watching Korean dramas, but she wasn't watching things like Winter Sonata. She was watching historical dramas. The what I would consider there is. I'm trying to think what the Western name of the drama was, but there was a show around the same time about the palace cook who became a sort of an herbal doctor, practitioner or something, and the Korean name was Daejangum.
Okay.
And I can't remember whether the name of the translated name of it is The Love in the Palace or something like that. I would have to look that up. But she was watching either outright historical fiction, where there was a lot of like reenactments about emperors ruling or like princesses becoming, coming to power, trying to come to power, or the wars between the Korean kingdoms and so forth. So to me, like, I wasn't even aware that there was this whole other subgenre of like heavy romance Korean dramas. And going back to just looping back to the female gaze, or female voices, once I realized that such a thing did exist, I was like, oh, wait. I can feel like I am hearing from people with similar experiences. Even if it was in Korea, it was still similar experiences with mine in the sense that it wasn't a man's experience, if that makes sense.
It does. And how do you feel as if that, like, so you watched, Winter Sonata, I had to look it up too. So it's older than I thought.
That's why I laughed when you said it's not that old.
I was like, okay, no, you're right. It is. I mean, look, it's not ancient, but I mean, it's post 9/11, but just essentially.
It's not black and white.
I mean, it's clear. It came out in 2002. I was thinking for some reason, I think I confused, and this is just like me for no good reason. The drama I always confuse Winter Sonata with I think it's because it gets shown on like my For You when I get recommended. I get recommended that next to That Winter, The Wind That Blows.
Yeah.
Which is a completely different drama, I know. But I think that I like lump it then into like the early aughts, essentially.
Right.
As opposed to like 2002 is like, yeah, that is definitely more OG. So I do apologize for that. Again, it's not black and white, but yeah, it's had its moment. It's a legal adult voter at this point.
Right.
But how has it felt for you in seeing kind of like the rise of Hallyu being so popular now and becoming something? Because I think that I see a lot of ambivalence sometimes of like happiness, but also from like folks who like kind of endured like more overt othering, kind of being like, I used to have people like make fun of me for this and now it's cool.
So I have two minds about it, and they're not necessarily in contradiction with each other, but you can tell me what you think or how it sounds as someone who's not from Korea.
Okay.
On the one hand, I'm very extremely and unbelievably proud of how popular, not just popular is not even the right word, how well known and widely seen Korean dramas and Korean movies have become. Because I think there's a lot that the Korean art scene has to show the world. And I think I feel a connection with my culture in a different way slightly than someone who was born here.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like what Korea is going through now is very similar to what I'm experiencing, in the sense that we're both finding our voices, our own voices. We're both able to go beyond being told not to be seen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I think Korean culture specifically for years had been considered not Chinese, not Japanese, right? There's Akira Kurosawa in Japan. There's, Wong Kar-wai in China. They're the great filmmakers that exist in both of those countries and other Asian cultures, Bollywood and India. And I think a lot of people were kind of lost a little bit about what Korean culture really is. But I think internet has changed that a lot. I think the popularity of K-pop has changed that a lot. But I would say that the most important aspect of K-dramas that I think that I, at least personally for myself, I feel is the most important is that it really is from a female perspective. And you alluded to that already. And that I think is what I am most proud of, that there are, even though they're male directors, most of the writers are still women. So it's their way of getting the female voice out there, if that makes sense. That's not 100% of the shows, but it's a majority of the shows.
Yeah. And I've reflected on that more and more, especially in seeing kind of, and again, this isn't to like hold Korea to like some standard that like I don't hold any other culture to, but when we talk about like some of the misogyny and we're seeing like, like the Telegram scandals and things like that. And I mean, again, this is like a global issue. This is like not me calling out like one country to say what's wrong with just this place, but it's prevalent there. And we can see like the fact that like even like the word feminism is like a very fraught term in Korea, which I think, is something that in the West, like that's not as related. Like when I heard that for the first time, like that was a surprise. And that was like a moment to be like, okay, that's different. And not to say like there's places in the US as well that you're going to go to that's not going to be a word that people use and that people aren't going to feel comfortable using that. But it definitely is like in a larger scale, like a more accepted term and viewpoint.
And I think my hot take on that is I think the reason there is, at least to us in the Western world, there are these surprising and in some cases shocking incidents that are still happening. I think I'm hoping that it's the last throes, the last gasping breaths of true misogyny, deeply ingrained, institutionalized cultural and misogyny. I'm hoping. But that's why I'm saying that so this is what I was referring to when I said I'm of two minds about it, because that's the one thought that I feel like there is an identity, not just to my country of origin and culture of origin, but also that Korea is going through something that's very similar to my own personal experience, that the evolution is happening sort of in tandem. The other aspect, the other side of my emotional experience with all the things that are happening with not just K culture, but also what's happening in the societal makeup of Korea is that it makes growing pains very, very visible. And democracies go through certain growth spurts. It's like any teenager that goes through growth spurts.
Yeah.
And sadly for me, and it's unnerving for me when I think about it, the entire world is seeing it. And one thing that many K-culture consumers may not remember is that for all intents and purposes, Korean media really has only been in existence since the 50s. It's really young. And I would say even the democracy itself has really only been around since, technically, probably, if you're looking at the actual definition of democracy, probably not until the late 70s, early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Because the country was under martial law for such a long time and had military dictatorship. But the Korean culture that we see today really wasn't born until that military dictatorship went away.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very young culture in terms of consumption of media. And a lot of the people that are complaining about the weaknesses of the Korean media, and I don't mean the news media, but the culture itself with K-dramas, Korean music, K-pop, even the art scene, I think they're forgetting that it's like the equivalent of, tweener, maybe? Would that be a good comparison, maybe?
Tweeter.
Tweener. Someone who's not.
Okay, yes. I was like, tweeter. What? Yeah, a tweener. Yeah. No, that makes. Yeah. And I think that you're speaking to is real in the sense that, like, look, you're seeing how many. There's different debates on where we're at in our own, like, quasi empire right now. And it's like America, right? And so, you see some people that are like, we're like moving towards a failed state. You're seeing some people that are saying this could be like some normed growing pains. It's hard to say. I mean, like, we know that, like, yeah, I'm not going to speak to that right now of like where we're at in that, but we definitely know that, like, we're not just like in some stable cycle of like everything's copacetic at all by any stretch. And so
but it is still more established than the Korean.
Yes, absolutely. And so I just think that we're at like a different, like, so I'm like, what are we, like a midlife crisis? If you're talking about cleaner, we're more like the midlife crisis. What does this all mean? Like, we're much further down. And yeah, and I do think it's interesting when we talk about like holding something, like, not to bring BTS back into this, but a quote that really resonated with me, and I'm going to like butcher it because I don't have it in front of me. So I'm just going to give like the vibe of it is at one point, like the leader for BTS, Kim Namjoon, somebody was basically like, what is up with like Koreans working so hard? Like, what is that all about? Like, why, what is that? And his answer was essentially kind of like back off colonizers. And like, I really appreciated that so much for him to say that too, because I think the other thing that like happens, especially in looking at a country like Korea, is like, it's a tweener, and some of the reasons why are very much linked to like the like complete geopolitical dynamics that came out of World War II. And what does the US hold as like, and where have we really been, like, where are we as a nation responsible for? So I just find it always to be very challenging, especially from a position of a country that has a lot of colonial baggage, different to the British, but still very colonial, and like what we've done in many different regions. And like, sitting from a place of just pure judgment never feels like quite so easy to me either, because it feels a little too smug for like where we should be holding ourselves a little bit more like responsible and accountable.
And I would say post-colonial in such a complicated way too, right? Because the American military is still maintaining a presence there. And on top of that, it's only been about 100 years since the last real major occupation by an imperialist state in Korea. I mean, anyone who's watching Pachinko may have a slightly better idea and understanding of that aspect of the Korean history than other people might. But all that to say, when someone who's 12, 13 years old are first beginning to understand and recognize their own agency, they act out a lot. They might stay out past curfew. I don't know. 13, 14-year-olds do have a curfew. I don't know how many 13, 14-year-olds adhere to curfews, but it's sort of akin to that in the sense.
I have a 13-year-old and I have a 15-year-old. So I'm going to speak to that. And I think your analogy checks out. I mean, mine adhere to curfews, but I would say that there is a sense of, in some ways, like very deep wisdom. And in some ways, like reaction.
What are you doing? Yeah, exactly. Like, what are you thinking when you did that? And that's sort of, I feel like that's what the Korean culture is going through. And that's one of the reasons why I have this duality where on the one hand, I'm like, wow, you're about to enter high school and you're doing great. And you're on track to be you can do whatever you want. You can be a doctor, an astronaut, whatever. But on the other hand, I'm like, wow, I can't believe you made that mistake. You missed that whole exam. Really? Like, that's how I feel about. It's not just the culture of what we see here. It's what I hear from my relatives. There's a growing divide between the generations, for example, that is probably analogous to a lot of the generational rifts that we see currently in our current election cycle. And not to add a whole other element to it, there is, I'm reluctant to bring a whole other aspect into this discussion, but I I'll throw it out there. I think the involvement of international fandoms confuses Koreans. And I think that the companies that, not just the agencies, not just the big agencies, but even the production companies, the creative teams, I think they're sometimes a little flummoxed because they want to create content that will make them acceptable, right? That people will accept and love and adore. But how do they do that while balancing their own desire to communicate whatever it is that they want to communicate? Like I'll use a recent drama as an example. I know you guys have talked about this a little bit. Queen of Tears. Yes, I know there's controversy around Queen of Tears. I don't know why.
I really welcome this because I feel like I welcome you schooling me on Queen of Tears.
You knew I was going to bring up the show because we've had discussions about it. Look, I'll say, I'll try and keep it really simple. I can see what the creators and the writers of Queen of Tears was trying to do. And for me, it resonated really deeply. And it yes, was it perfect? No. Yes, there were some things they dropped the ball on. I mean, there are very, very few pieces of art or creative endeavor that are 100% perfect. But for me, I felt like the reason Queen of Tears was so popular in Korea, I mean, it beat the record for Crash Landing on You in Korea for the viewership. I think the reason that happened is because it was the first truly intergenerational show that I've seen in recent years. And by that, I mean, you see the couple, the main couple that were in their 30s, but then you see their parents, and then you see her grandfather, and, you see this dynamic that you don't often see in other shows. And I also feel like the way that, albeit it was a Chaebol family, but it was a lot like Schitt's Creek, and that it was sort of a send up of the stereotype of an archetype that is so prevalent or has been so prevalent. But then there were some people who just didn't get that. And I think part of it was the lack of cultural context. But I think the other part of it was just not really looking at it for what it was. They were expecting it to be like some of the other shows that people like. Lovely Runner, while I loved it, was a different kind of show. But they were trying to compare, is it Queen of Tears or Lovely Runner? I'm like, why does it have to be one and not the other? So that is my one example of where I feel like the creators had a vision. They did the best they could, keeping in mind that they wanted a global audience. And they had a wildly successful run in Korea and not as much overseas.
And I really appreciate it because I think this is where a podcast like what we do has to have, I think we have an interesting like role that we play. And this is where I always want to like caution anyone who listens or consumes, like reads any reviews, ever like looks at people giving feedback, just always use like that critical lens, even against like, especially against us too. And it's because it's the idea of like, what is good or what is entertaining. It's always going to be shaded through someone's perspective. And yeah. And I live in this like book world, right? Where like constantly like books are like thrown on Goodreads and like, is this good? Is this bad? And like the lenses people use are very personal to themselves, which makes sense. But we're not doing like a scholarship here in it. It's kind of like, and so I would say like the perspective that we're holding is the one that like we say, and this isn't like a defense or anything. It's just to say like to name what it always is, which is 3 white Americans who write romance novels talking about plot. And so I think that something that has like stayed with me too is another drama that I think is an interesting take. And I came out the one, and I'm not saying this to like virtue signal myself. I came out, I enjoyed my Mister, but it was not like my favorite drama ever, but I enjoyed it. For many people, it's like their top drama. but my co-hosts like did not resonate with it, like was not for them. And a lot of it has to do, so Afternoona Asks, which is like one of our offshoot podcasts, where we have Sarah, who is Hong Kong and British citizen, like that's like their background. And then we have Grace, who is Korean American. And like, I feel like in some ways I've just been really grateful that they had like an interest and an energy to kind of do an offshoot podcast for us, or not for us. God, that's like a horrible thing to say, to partner with us, essentially, to like do an offshoot that could be their own space to talk about things. Because I think when you layer in, like, for example, with my Mister, kind of when they did their deep dive and talked about for like came from like the Confucian principles and the backgrounds and what was happening there.
That was a great pod, by the way.
Fantastic and really enlightening. And I also like say I also would understand why like Amy and Megan like I wasn't thinking about Confucian principles when I was watching it. I just like slice of life, more like serious looks at things better. So like that's like I came out not because I'm like culturally like more sensitive or smarter. I just have like a more like stated interest in kind of slice of life dramas. But the pacing and the way like the story was structured just like wasn't going to resonate for them as like where they held their identities. And I think that like that is like useful context when people like listen to us talk about things, to be like, if somebody's not liking it, where is that coming from? What is it coming from? So for me with Queen of Tears, I didn't have like the family dynamics I enjoyed. I definitely didn't have like the nuance. Like, I'm not going to give myself credit for that, but like I did like the Schitt's Creek aspect just in general. I think for me, mine is just so shallow. I mean, it really is. But I I had like a couple of things that just like didn't happen for me in the drama the way I needed it to make me like super excited. But it has nothing to do with like a culture critique. It has everything to do with just like I really wanted the villain to have like a much different arc. I was like much more interested in their story than like I think the show gave. And so for some reason, like it really got me. Like the whole time I kept being like, there's so much to do with the villain. Why aren't we getting more of that?
I don't disagree with that at all. I am with you on that.
So I think, yeah. So, and again, I'm not going to be in a place of like defense or not. It's just for me, there were like some things like that kind of just like happened more where I was like, why did that run out? But, and I think because I lacked some of like the lived in experience and nuance as well, that some of the things that it was getting really right just didn't mean as much to me, probably. I just was kind of like, yeah, sure. As opposed to being like, oh, I'm finding this very impactful.
But I think you just hit the nail on the head. The reasons why you didn't like it, you recognize that you didn't necessarily have the lived experience. Like you have the awareness, even if you don't have the cultural experience, you have the awareness of looking at things through a critical lens. Whereas I think that some of the discussions that I heard and read were people saying things like, well, I didn't find the parents' relationship very interesting, or I didn't understand the thing with the grandfather. I'm like, you don't understand that in not every family is like this, of course, but the extended family is like a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when a lot of conflict happens, it's usually with the extended family.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that to me was one of the reasons why the show, and maybe it's just my own personal experiences with my own family and throughout the culture of Korea that allowed me to understand that storyline, or those storylines. But even like with her aunt being so like the first two, oh boy, this is a spoiler. I won't spoil it, but her aunt plays a significant role in one of the later plot points.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about. And I got that because I am very, very close with all of my aunts, but especially to one particular aunt who is like a second mother to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of American, or sorry, not just American, but Western audience members may not get that because they really only grew up with a nuclear family, or the relationship with the extended family has a completely different context. And even the whole thing with the grandfather and so forth, they didn't get the whole like relationship between the granddaughter and the grandfather. And that was one of the things they pointed out. They're like, well, why was he even needed for the plot? And like, because that's
yeah,
a very important relationship. and I honestly, I kind of get speechless when people make critiques like that, because I'm like, well, I don't go into your household and critique your household.
Yeah. And I think that's what gets tricky again about like when we give reviews or critique in spaces to just say, yeah, I mean, it is always like the nuance and the context, the background of the person really matters. And so like, yeah, when I see people be like, this is boring or I don't like it. And look, I've done the same for so many things where I'm just like, it's boring. I just didn't like this thing. But when anyone is saying it, I think it's like always worthwhile to be like, well, why? Who are they? What's been their track record to date? Like, where are they coming from? And I think that like it has made me try at least, and again, this isn't like me trying to give myself flowers because I think that, I'm going to screw up all the time, but it's trying to have a sense of like curiosity. And sometimes sometimes you're allowed to just watch things at face value. You really are. Like I watched Chicken Nugget and was just
I can't believe you watched it.
And again, like, look, there's probably things that like I could have learned and grown from Chicken Nugget. I really do. I take that point. And people who are like, there are people who are like, I loved it. I found it so subversive. I found it like so satirical. And I didn't. And that doesn't mean that it's not satirical. That doesn't mean it's not subversive. It's just for me, I felt like I was like enduring every second I was watching it.
But I think the difference, if I may interject, the difference for me is that not just your pod, but your sister pods, all of them, they are all very careful about saying it's not for me, but it doesn't mean it's not for others. And you're very good about explaining why you didn't like something. And it's never from this perspective of being dismissive or laughing at an aspect of a culture that is not familiar to you. And that's what I appreciate.
Well, thank you for that. And I think honestly, a lot of it just has to do with the fact that like, how many times have I been dragged online, especially in like the last year for like books I've written and like, not even from like a problematic standpoint. Like, I mean, please call me at any time I'm problematic, but just from like, I don't like it cause kind of stuff. And it's really, and so, and it makes me just think more and more over time of like, everyone is allowed to be a critic. Everyone's allowed to have a space. Everyone's allowed to have thought. And to just remember, like, sometimes I'm just another person having like that thought too. So like, just, yeah, I think it's like trying to have like a little bit of like that humility of it. And like when people ask like, do I like this book or do I not like this book? I think I've just tried over time to be more human about that too, to be like, well, it wasn't for me, but it could very much be for you. Like, it's rare I'm going to be like, that's just bad. I hate it. If anything, I think I've become, as I've gotten like older, more, this is a whole other rabbit hole we don't have time or space to get into. But like when it comes to like dark romance, for example, quote unquote dark romance.
Yeah.
In my beginnings of romance, there were times where I would say that I was like completely against it, and felt like very morally comfortable being completely against it. And as I've gotten older, I think I've heard enough arguments that have made sense to me about like why just like that initial knee-jerk reaction to hate on it doesn't feel like I basically feel like I heard enough people make a case where I was like, oh, I really need to rethink my thoughts. And there are still like some, but yeah, I think overall I've had like a very 180 shift on like the dark romance space and the idea of like certain like plot points in books. Because like, again, we were talking about like how we grew up with books where, I mean, here's the thing is I think it's not always intent. I mean, I'm not going to make it all sound like super smart and everyone writing like, non-consent or dub consent are doing it from a point of high intellectualism. I don't think that, but I do think some people are doing it from that more than I was giving any credit to. And overall, it's just made me think about, oh man, this is like a whole other topic of can of worms. So I'm just trying to think of how much to say to like wrap up the point so we can keep moving. But essentially to say that like, I think that like I grew up with that being the books that I read as a whole. I got older and was like, oh, that's bad. And then I was kind of like, so that's always bad. And then I got older again and heard people be like, is it bad though? Because like, here's some compelling reasons why like this could be empowering or people could find value, or there's reasons that this can make sense. And then all of a sudden I was like, okay, I hear that too. Like just keep shifting and growing and learning from that too. But I do think it's good to hear from people. And that's why I think like hearing from you as well, saying, here's why Queen of Tears really spoke to me. This is where I think there were like people that were just like missing core points that should have like, it should have gotten more credit for it. But then also what becomes really like, I think about it from a writer's point of view. And this is where like, I would love to have enough contacts or enough like wherewithal to be able to talk to some drama writers at some point. Like this is a plea I put out into the world. Like I would love to do this. And I don't know if like, I'm just going to manifest it, because you also have to think about like, you're writing you're pulling from like your culture and lived experiences. Yes, you're going to be imaginative. Yes, you're going to have like demons or whatever you're going to have in it. And like, you're going to make stuff larger in life, but you're pulling from that. And you're also seeing that like, now the world is all lined up being like, give it to me too. And so there's like this added pressure now to be like, not only are you being competitive as a writer, because writing is competitive, and not only are you competing in like a market that is like your own country, now you're trying to be like, and what's going to like jump ship and become like the runaway hit that like Netflix is going to pick, like all these places are going to pick up and promote too. And that must be really challenging.
Yeah. And I know you want to wrap up this point, but I will just add to that one quick thought, which is, I would love to manifest it out into the universe as well for you to be able to meet some of the writers at some point, because I think that would be so interesting as a Korean American, especially to hear what that interaction is like and what, if anything, comes out of that interaction. And the primary reason is because I think the Western culture could benefit from that input from not just Korean culture, but other cultures generally. But also, I think that the Korean culture, which was so insular for so long, could also benefit from that as well. So totally off topic, but I think I would love to see that happen.
Yeah, look, I'm just going to start speaking it and see if it happens. You never know. But yeah, I would welcome it. I think it would. I'm just always interested too in hearing about people's writing processes. And the way drama is, like when I first learned, of course, there's like some dramas that are like pre-done. I mean, it's very rare, but like, there's dramas that are like pre-shot, pre-done. But once I started to realize that people were writing dramas kind of in production and having that, like, I think I've also tried to give that space too, because yes, I get grumpy with like the serial killer plots. Yes, I get grumpy with like the white truck. The white truck. I mean, I got grumpy in Queen of Tears for like the multiple of accidents that kind of start to happen in the back half. And I'm like looking at myself, I'm writing a book right now. I'm like, am I so different? Like you hit these points where you're like, I just need something to happen so I can get to the next point. I just need something. And like, sometimes you're just like, look, I'm tired. And like, I have to just come up with something. And I think that's a space that like in commercial fiction, or I'm guessing like, I'm going to call it like commercial screenwriting or drama writing. Like you're on this deadline, like you're just a person. And sometimes it's going to be like cranking and it's going to be good and it's all coming together and it's all wild. And then there's times where like when you can see it, you're like, look, I try to sometimes be like, it's annoying, but like, I get it. Like, like sometimes you just wanted to go home that night. You're like, I need to get
I feel like that's a whole episode on its own, right? Like trying to read the minds of the writers.
Yeah. And be like, at what point did you, because there's times where I feel like, and again, that's where like, you've got these like existing frameworks that are really interesting. Like, let's say it's like, okay, this is gonna be 16 episodes, for example. So you have a story that's going to be like such a strong start. You're gonna have a story that, you can like hit the home in the middle, but like, or hit home the end. But then you've got that like saggy middle that's sitting there. And sometimes you're going to be like, ooh, it's happening and it's all clicking through. And sometimes you're going to be like, I don't know. But I look at my own writing. I look at a lot of other people's writings. And like, this is not like K-drama writers are not alone in the struggle of this. And right now, yeah, especially drafting a book, like I'm just writing today their first kiss. So for me in romance, what's always challenging is like you have this like anticipation build up to like a first kiss that like keeps people going because they're like, I want to see them at least like kind of hook up. And I mean, I write open doors, so like they're gonna like eventually like within the next 10 to 15,000 words have sex. But then after that, I'm always like, okay, then how do you keep like, for me, it's like, how do you then like, you've kind of had that like artificial like leg of buy-in where like people are like, I just want to get to the point where like, you know, I see the connection, I see this all paying off. And then you know that you have to get through some kind of like no man's land to get to like a crisis point that's going to then carry you to the end. And that no man's land that happens, that's a hard place for anyone to be in.
I'm actually very curious to hear your thoughts on if you think that the amount of Western media companies being in Korea right now, such as Netflix and Disney, is impacting the kind of stories and writing that is currently being made.
I feel like I probably, again, don't feel like the best like person to say I have like such a holistic perspective to give something like really intelligent. But this is what I'm going to say that's kind of like not as satisfying, but I'm just going to like kind of make it as like a
what's Leah's thought?
Yeah, my thought right now is something I've noticed for me is I've been having a tendency of enjoying dramas from like 2014 to 16 more than dramas coming out right now. And I've been trying to like think why. And some of them feel like a little, honestly, they feel edgier. They feel like they're willing to like go, like I was just like, I had just sold Amy on It's Okay, That's Love.
I was just going to ask if you had that one in mind.
Yeah. So that's one I have in mind for sure. Coffee Prince is another. Like there's a few that I just feel like around that time, I feel like these are really kind of like, they're not always elegantly like tying it up from like, you know, the most West, like, you know, and I mean, like, yeah, there was like a problematic gay subplot at the beginning of Coffee Prince. And yes, there's like some problematic representation that can happen in mental health and It's Okay, That's Love. But we're not going to let perfect be the enemy of the good. Overall, I would say that they were really interesting and reaching for conversations that I think like were important to grapple with. And I do think that there's still that happening. But like for my personal taste, I feel like sometimes when I'm watching stuff, it feels just like a little bit too much like it's just trying to play it safe all the time to make as many people happy as possible.
That's why I was asking that, because I think the I don't want to say the lowest common denominator, but that sort of the broad reach that everyone is reaching for, I think it is having an impact on I don't want to say the quality of content because that's subjective, but I would say the type of content that we're getting. But to your point about dramas from the teens being more interesting and potentially more edgy, even Full House. I don't know if Full House you remember, but even Full House it has some elements that may be considered not subversive necessarily, but certainly edgier, like the whole quote unquote open relationship that the two secondary characters had, for example, because that's not something people talked about out in the open, certainly here in the Western hemisphere.
And I mean, I can think of dramas that I feel like I would say are, I mean, like, so again, there's not that there's like a dearth of them. Like My Liberation Notes comes to mind as one that I think is pretty like, you know, I feel like that was interesting and like was like, I felt like that was like very ambitious and like what it was trying to tell a story.
And I couldn't get through that.
Okay. I mean, what part made you, was it the alcoholism or what was the, okay.
Yeah, because I felt like that was being, we could talk for hours about this, but I'll try and say it in a nutshell. I think that plot point was they were trying really hard to shoehorn in what I would consider a more Western lens to the plot, to the existence of boozy living. I don't know what else. I don't know what the right terminology is, but we were alluding to it earlier about how consumption of alcohol is such a mainstreamed idea in Korean culture generally, not just in K-dramas, but I know that in talking with my own family and friends, they talk about, oh yeah, we tried this new thing and we finished 3 bottles of it in one sitting. Like that's a very common topic of conversation. And with that show, I felt like it was trying so hard to be serious about it without really talking about it.
I think I am really appreciating you carrying it, because again, when you're saying it's speaking to a Western, mindset of some of these topics, and then me being like a white American being like, okay, well, resonate. And I mean, for some of my co-hosts, like they can't handle any of this, and not because of the content, like Amy, for example, is like, I just can't, like, this writer is not for me. The way they paint their dramas, the way they do their characterization, it's just not for me. It's always really, she's always really been for me. And so in that one, I will say that, like, yes, his journey and his story, I feel like I probably understand where you're going with it. I found that his part to be kind of like the least compelling. I was really obsessed with the brother and the sister in that drama. I did like the main couple though with Mr. Gu. I did like the worship me part. I thought that was always really great. But the 3,000 bottles of soju stacked around him in his bedroom. I mean, it did feel like Nicolas Cage leaving Las Vegas a bit.
That is exactly why I couldn't get through it, because I was like, oh, I feel like this has been done. And it's just, even in Korean media, it's been done.
Yeah. So I take your point on that. So I gave an example. I think it's very fair if you're like, meh, not that one. To me, though, overall, I thought that was like a successful, like, the brother's story and where the brother ended up is something I still think about, like, almost weekly. And I guess you don't know where he ended up because he's not watching the drama.
Okay, I'll watch it past the.
I'll just tell you offline where the brother ended up.
Yeah.
Where he ended up as like his chosen kind of path forward to me was like, I don't know what it was, but it really got me in like a very like emotional way. And so I think about that one a lot. I also think about, like, I'm trying to think of like, I mean, like, no, there's quite a few. I mean, like, here's the other thing that I'm wondering, and I'm just speculating again, because like I'm just like kind of talking off cuff, is it's not that there's not edgier, kind of like groundbreaking or challenging dramas being made. It's maybe that there's like so many being made too, that like it becomes
That's
like
fair.
And so that's a question I have. Like, I haven't done like an analysis to be like, what's the hard hitting versus not, but there's just so many always come. I do know there's so many always coming because it's impossible, because people are like, please watch this, please watch this, please watch this. And it's like, I honestly, I like, you can't, even like the most avid watcher can't keep up with everything that's coming.
And yet sometimes I feel like, oh, what is there to watch?
Yeah. Although it's like, you done looking, there's still so much, but it's like, yes, I do. Yeah. I think it's both, because it's also like, what is there to watch? Because I feel like everything I like want to see, I've seen.
Well, that's part of it. I think that there's a little bit of the same types of shows that are being made, but then the other part of it is you have to be in a certain mood to watch certain types of shows.
Yes. And so when you're like in that mood and you're like, there's nothing to watch, that, yeah, I think that's a really fair way to articulate. There's nothing to watch. Of course, there's bazillions to watch, but you're like, I'm in the mood for this. And I've kind of exhausted what I know that exists here.
And I think that right now, my K-drama watching, that's the phase I'm in, because life itself is so chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
I want escapism, but I want confection. I want, if you remember the Madewell cookies and treats, which there was no nutritional value whatsoever, but you enjoyed it while you were consuming it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right now, today, that's what I want. And not like my liberation notes where I'm going to actually have to work.
Yeah.
what I'm
I
watching.
want something that's funny. It's like, I don't want necessarily, personally, I'm not in the mood for my liberation notes. And I'm also not in the mood for like candy. I think I'm in the mood for just like where I normally sit, honestly, which is high high angst is like my candy, if that makes sense to you. Like my candy would be like less like this like fluffy romance and more just like absolute yearning for each other. But I don't want like a big subplot that I have to like noodle out. I don't want a time jump I have to noodle out. I kind of just want to watch like this intense emotional edging that happens.
The funny thing is, when I say I want confection, I don't mean the fluffy kind. I want the kind that's like very, yes, angsty, but also where there's actual tension and no pun intended friction.
Yeah.
Like my sweet mobster,
Uh-huh.
a complete surprise for me. Like it was not what I thought it was going to be candy. I thought it was going to be silly. And there were silly moments, but that moment of when I found out the big reveal, I was like, oh, I actually had to work to get to that point. Does that
Yeah. Yeah, no, My Sweet Lobster was a giant surprise because when everyone started saying that they were watching it, I was like, I'm never going to watch this. I'm never going to watch this for like the most shallow of reasons, but because it was like My Sweet Mobster. And this is funny because like I didn't watch Vincenzo, like I'm making Amy watch The Godfather this month because I
know.
I do love Sopranos. So, I mean, I'm being hypocritical in this, but in general, if you're telling me like a drama is going to come in with like a heavy mobster element, I'm like, literally could care less. Please don't make me watch it. So when it was actually called My Sweet Mobster, I was like, no, I won't ever watch it. And then like Megan's like, I like it. And I'm like, that's great. Like you like lots of things I'm never going to watch. And then I don't know, I just kept hearing like people talk about it. So I started it. And when I started it, I was like, I don't like the first episode was not successful for me. But it also made me be like, whatever this is, isn't what I was expecting. So I'm going to give it like a second episode. And I got hooked in the second episode.
Well, Tegu, like he's one of the reasons, right? Because his dimensionality of his character was so unexpected.
Yeah.
But yes, the mobster aspect of it, that was actually a deterrent for me as well. But I gave it a shot. And yes, just like you, the first episode, I was like, oh, but I find that often happens with many dramas that I end up loving the first half episode or sometimes full episode, maybe sometimes in a second. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Do I want to watch this? I'm going to have to invest so much time. And then like by the time you get to the back half of the second episode, I'm like, okay, I'm hooked.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with that show.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah. And so I can tell like what I am in the mood for that like I want to see, and then I'm going to ask you the same question, is honestly for me, I want like a hospital playlist. I want something with like, a big cast where I get invested in all the different plot lines because there's like enough threads that like none of them get very tired. Like they stay fresh. So like when you bounce back and forth, you're like, ooh, I'm back to this one. What's happening here? And then, ooh, I'm back over here. And it's superhuman. The connections are really interesting and powerful. Some are sad, some are happy. But I miss hospital. I really want hospital playlist-ish to come back.
It's interesting you say that because I have that same yearning for that kind of content as well, especially that show. That show will always have a special place in my heart. The first season more than the second.
Mm-hmm.
But ironic that you mentioned that because I don't know if you're aware, but there are whisperings of a potential reunion and they are in pre-production, I believe. Maybe they're already in production of the Residence playlist.
So I had heard there were whisperings of 3, which look, I'll take it. And I had not heard about Residence playlist, and I will the Reply series and the Hospital series and the Prison Playbook series, or just Prison Playbook, is just to me they're just like the best. They're so good.
Playbook felt like a series, multiple seasons because it was so dense.
Yes. And so I just feel like that is like I to me that's like my like if I could have that over and over, because I know that I'm going to always be interested and curious. I feel, and this isn't like me to like denigrate like, oh, I know how this one's going to go, so I'm not as interested, because like Touch Your Heart, for example, like I don't feel like Touch Your Heart was like a super confusing, confounding, like I kind of knew where Touch Your Heart was going to go, yet I love Touch Your Heart. I mean, there's lots of like straight romances that I'll like. But and here again, I guess if I'm gonna just like not be a hater, but say that like to me, I was like, oh, I kind of want to watch it. And then as I was watching, I'm like, nah, it's just not working for me in like the way I want it to. It's like King the Land. I really wanted King the Land because Ho is gorgeous. The kiss and the sprinklers going off is hot. Like I was really into it for like the first chunk. And then I just started to get bored, honestly. For me personally, I just started to get bored.
King the Land was the biggest, in my mind, for me personally, it was the biggest disappointment.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you were like, that was my all-time favorite. You just...
No. It was my biggest disappointment because I think there was so much potential. And we love him. The female lead, I will not say not nice things about anybody, but
I liked it even when they got stuck on like the, like, you know, they took the boat out and got stuck. They had the one room, like all of that was fine. Like I was there through the kiss. That's where fear happens, is like you have the kiss and you're kind of like, okay, now I'm like, I've kind of gotten my like emotional something. I'm kind of done. That's what happened to me.
So my feeling about King the Land, I can't believe that I'm going to put this out into ether. But I felt like the entire show was a vehicle for various types of sponsorships and commercials.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't name the brands and I won't name what the product placements were, but it was even worse than the most egregious Subway ads. And by worse, I mean by leaps and bounds. I mean, there were whole episodes dedicated just to certain things. And I was just like, no, I'm not for this. I mean, I understand they have to get funding, but his talent was so squandered and wasted. Like I feel like I still have yet to see, other than Red Sleeve, I feel like he still hasn't been able to truly stretch his wings.
So I have not seen Red Sleeve. And that is, I know I am. I'm not going
to.
But I feel like I want to be at a really good capacity to watch it. Like I don't want to be watching it when I'm on deadline at like 11:30 at night just to fall asleep. Like I want to be able to like enjoy it. So I'm saving it for my book deadline is October 24th. And that doesn't mean like everything frees up for me. I'm gonna have to like move into edits pretty quickly. And my other book's coming out. So I'm gonna be busy. But I also know that like right now, my brain is like my day job, this book I'm on deadline for, my family, whatever the fuck's happening to the BTS world. It's like, that's my brain. And then anything that's left over is like what I've got the capacity to watch. And so like, I want to watch stuff that's like, I think I'm just in like, kind of like, just let me get through things that like, don't feel tedious. Don't make me work too hard. But Red Sleeve, I think Red Sleeve is like made for me personally.
Yeah. I was very pleasantly surprised. I mean, I loved him since The Good Manager, but Red Sleeve was a complete shocker in terms of how much I loved it.
Mm.
No, it's a drama.
Oh, sorry. I don't want to talk over you.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, because I'm not sure if you've seen it. The other drama I want to watch before the year ends, because this is a drama that this is where I take also like reviews have influenced me. And I've had times where I've been like, you know what? I regret that I let like people just and not, I mean, anyone's allowed to like anything. It's like my responsibility to decide if I'm like listening to it or not. But I think I let people, I think I just let the world put down Nevertheless. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'm not going to watch it. And seeing how much I liked Duna last year, which was a drama so many people didn't like, I was like, I honestly feel like there's a reasonable chance I'm going to enjoy Nevertheless. And I wish I had like given it a shot and I haven't. And so I'm like, I do want to watch it because I do really like very messy college age romances. I just always have.
We can watch that at the same time and see where we land.
Okay. So you haven't seen it yet either. Okay, cool.
I watched 20 minutes of the first, but remember what I said about the first episode. Like I just, if it doesn't grab me, sometimes I just can't.
Yeah. And I often, okay, here's another question I have for you. And then we'll start to slowly wrap it up because I could talk to you probably like all night. Is once you're going, can you tap out of it? Like, let's say you're like in it, like you've gotten like episode 10 or something. Are you like, I got to push through? Or are you like, I'm good?
So interesting question because my answer is it really depends. There are shows where I just have to watch it to the end just to see, like, no matter how bad it is. And even if I know I'll regret having lost that time that I can't reclaim, I'll watch it because I'm just like, it's not going where I think it's going, is it? And one example of that, and I do regret having lost the time, is Alice. Have you watched?
No, I haven't even heard of it.
It's sci-fi. I will let you decide if you want to explore it or not, but it's a sci-fi show about time travel. And there is a very problematic aspect of it, but we can talk about that offline.
Okay.
That is one show where I was like really like invested and I would say up until the halfway point, I was like, wow, this is very interesting. I haven't seen this kind of take on time travel before. And then I get to episode 5, 6, 7, where it occurred to me where it was going. And I'm like, I don't think I'm going to like where this is going, but I don't know if it's actually going to go there. So I'm going to continue. And then when I saw it, I was like, oh, they did. And so I regretted having spent the time, but I'm glad I saw it to the end.
Mm-hmm.
But other shows like That Winter, where I don't feel bad about not finishing it because, and I don't think this is because it's a little dated. They're just did you watch it to the end?
I've never watched it at all. I've just
Never watched, but you know what the plot is, right?
Yes.
Okay. Not to spoil it for anyone. There was something about the plot line where I just couldn't. Again, it's the same kind of thing where I knew what it was, but I had to decide, okay, do I want to see where they go? But I just couldn't. I think part of it is I don't love her.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the problem. I love him, but I didn't love her. So I think that's part of it. And I also have I have an issue with people who take on characters who are differently abled. That, you know what I'm saying? Like, that makes me very uncomfortable as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the other thing. So after episode 4 or 5, which is pretty early on, I had to drop it.
Yeah.
Because I physically could not sit with it. It made me very antsy.
So I drop a lot. I dropped Lovely Runner. And again, that's like the collective gasp of that. But I mean, and it had nothing to do, like, I wasn't like, oh, I'm like so anti it. I just like,
it wasn't for you.
I just like, honestly, it felt like if I feel like I'm like, I want to watch a drama, I should watch this. And I'm like, ugh, okay.
I know what you mean when someone says you have to watch all the Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever. I mean, I am a geek, so I have watched all of them. But if someone says to me, you have to watch it, I'm like, do I though? Do I really have to?
Yeah. And if I can just tell that, like, yeah, my sisters and I have talked about this before. Like, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no. And so, like, if I just feel like I have to, like, after the first episode, after the second episode, if I'm like, okay, I really mentally need to like push myself to watch this, then I'm like, look, I'm just overall, I don't want to do it then, because then it feels like homework and I don't want to do
like a chore.
Yeah. Drama watching is not a chore for me. And if that's the case, then I'm just going to like peace out and watch like, I mean, BL's always going to give me like a very short angst fix. So I can always watch, I can almost always find like an angsty BL to fill my like angst bucket when I'm like trying to find something else to watch. But I do want to I am really looking forward to having my capacity open up in like the next, I don't want to think about it too hard because I have so much work to do, but in like the next 6 to 8 weeks. Because the other thing is that when I first started watching and I was in the pandemic, like I always was involved in publishing. Like I have a company that does like book production, but it was only in like the last, it's been more than a half year, but you know, it's only been in like since maybe like November of last year that I really actively started like writing under contract again. And the impact that had on me watching, I think, has been significant, mostly because my mental capacity gets really, really like, it just gets so depleted. because, you're like in like book mode. And even when I'm not writing, honestly, I spend most of my time not writing and just being stressed or like affected by the book. Like the button chair actual writing time is like not stressful. It's all the time I'm not writing that I'm thinking about it, which is like the rest of my life that like stresses me out. So I think that like it really has changed, like the fact that I used to do like power binges and I would go to like 4 a.m. watching shows and blah, blah, blah. I mean, like not healthy, but like fun. I don't have that in me right now because right now I'm normally writing to like 1 if I like have a chance. And like that's not, I'm not going to pop on a drama after.
So it sounds to me like I should get off my butt and start writing seriously the way I've been meaning to for the past 35 years, because that's the kind of brain engagement and room taking that I think I need to distract me from real life, because there's just too much going on in the world.
Take that as your sign of yes. And take that as your sign of like, it's never too late. And take that as a sign that there's never a good time, because it has never been convenient to write for me. I have never written in a way that feels like, oh, this is like what a writer, like we've talked about this in the pod before. Like I even still like hear of other writers writing and I'll be like, oh, they must write in like a good, like a smart way. Whereas I'm like writing on my phone, walking in circles in the parking lot at my job to like get word count and stuff. Like it's never like a way that I feel like is, I never have like the desk with like the bank lamp and the green, with the green like glass and it like looks intellectual. So yeah, I think if you've got an interest in writing, do it. And honestly, I'll cheer you on and I'll tell you it sucks, because it really fucking sucks to write. But having written is great. There's nothing better than having written.
And I have a follow-up question that, which is, I know you say that it takes up so much of your brain space because you're thinking about what you're needing to write, but how much of that do you think goes toward what you end up putting on paper?
Sometimes good, sometimes bad. I mean, because again, I'm making it sound smarter than it is. Like you would think, oh, yes, it's fine and good. You should be thinking about your plot and you must be like untangling all these things. A lot of times my brain literally is just going, fuck, you're not writing. That's what I'm saying is like the depleting part. It's very rare my brain is like, ooh, and then this can happen, and then this can happen. The actual smart plot point making for me happens incredibly quickly and incredibly sporadically, where I'll be like, oh, this, and this. Yes, that's really good. Those are smart ideas. If I'm lucky enough, I can write them down. I also plot my books in advance now. I used to not, but now I do. And that's been really helpful to me with like much limited like mental capacity, is like, I just like, I'm like, what's my homework for today? And I've already like previous me has already done the homework of like, today, this chapter will have this, and this happening. So that really helps me. I think it's just mostly the fact that there's like this like unspoken pressure that's like always there that like haunts me, that takes my mental capacity.
So I think that anxiety, that's actually a productive way of channeling anxiety prone people, right? Because I need something like that, because my mind I'm constantly working on things in my mind. And I'm trying to pivot in my career right now. And, there's that space. There's what's going on in the world. I'm trying to, there are just so many projects that I have, but none of them are really in that mode of really taking up space, the kind of space I needed to in my mind. So we can take this offline and have a separate conversation.
But yeah, and I will cheerlead you and I will cheerlead anyone that has thought about writing, because honestly, it is like, I'm always happy to do certain things and I'm never happy to do other things. And then we can like move to the wrap up of like the dramas and where we're going with this. But the things I'm always happy to do are to affirm that it seems very, it can, at least it did to me. It felt very unrealistic to say I was going to write a book. And even when I started writing my very first book, it still felt unrealistic. I just felt like I was almost embarrassed to be like, yeah, I'm writing a book. And when I got to the end of it, so it took me like a year to write my first book. It did help me kind of like mentally be like, okay, I like did that. And then I was like, I don't know. And every time now I start a book, I'm always like, I don't know if I can actually write a book, even though like I've now written like over 20 books. Like, I actually don't remember how to really do this again. But like, you kind of, so the part is like, you really, like, just want to demystify the fact that like, writing is literally just sitting in a chair and like making the words come out, and somehow not hating what you're doing enough and like being so self-critical that you stop doing it. Because I think that happens to so many people is like, you get this good idea, you start doing it, then you're like, God, I kind of do suck at this. And then you're like, now I'm like, what's the point? And I'm going to stop. That happens very frequently. So you have to somehow just have like the ability to like push through that part. Of like, like, yes, I like, this doesn't feel good. And sometimes you're going to write stuff and be like, I feel like I'm such a genius. Like, oh my God, I can't even handle like great I am. But most of the time for me, it's like, oh my God, this just like, it's like my agent. I feel like I'm such an ER. My agent will be like, how's it going? And if I'm like honest, I'll be like, it sucks and I suck and I don't know, good luck. But she hasn't liked those answers. So now I'm just always like, it's great. Couldn't be better.
Thanks for that firsthand sharing your firsthand experience with all of that, because I've always been curious about how the process works. I know people who've written, but they're like nonfiction writers.
Yeah. So for me, and that's just my take, is that like, I just think that like, you have to just have that tenacity to kind of just be like, and like the humility, I think, to just be like, it's okay. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get through, once you get through that first draft, you can clean it up as much as you need to. And also just like never letting perfect be the enemy of good. Like when people are like, what books should I read of yours? I really struggle because I'm like, I don't know if I've ever had a book, and Megan and Amy are different too. Like everyone treats their work differently. For me, and I'm not trying to be like a big drama queen about it, it's hard for me to be like, oh, here's the book I'm like super proud of. Like every time, like I'm not like, I need to be like happier about all of this. I don't mean to sound negative because I'm not like unproud of it. Like I am proud, but it's hard for me sometimes to be like, oh, well, this felt really good. Because I'm always just like, every time I do it, I'm like, I tried real hard.
It's a challenge for all of us to stay positive, I think.
Yeah. And so that's why I think I extend that to drama spaces so much too. So like whoever wrote King to Land, I'm like, you tried real hard. Like you really did. You had some highs. There was
yeah, the marketing people had a big hand in that, I think, though.
Yeah. So yeah, I would love to get, somebody product placement, hire me and I'll just have like, Subway and Coke shots in all my books.
Better way to put them in.
So all of this to say, in this long, lengthy conversation that we've had, is that I do think that, like, yeah, there is an aspect of like dramas and shows and reading that there is like there's a universalness in it, but then there's like the universality of like, yes, we all are in these collective spaces enjoying content, and there's things that bring us together and unify us and that we're all into. And we still can't ignore the fact that like,
yes,
there's nuance in it as well. Like some aspects aren't universal.
Right. Exactly. And I would say that with AI becoming what it is now, I think that things are going to get even trickier, because I don't know how much of original thinking we're going to see as AI gets integrated further and deeper in the corporate world, at least in the Western world anyway, in the Western corporate culture. I don't know how it will work in the whole creative process of Korean media that we consume. But I would say for me, I'm very eagerly awaiting to see what the next chapter will be for the Hallyu movement, the Korean culture movement. I'm optimistic, but cautiously. So,
yeah, I think that my rose-colored glasses were always problematic, and so I'm glad they're off. But also sometimes I'm just like, sometimes you're just sad for like because like if you're saying like, for me as like a consumer of like Hallyu content, I'm not even like a tween. I'm kind of like a prepubescent, like
you're further along than you give yourself credit for.
Okay, but I feel like I'm at the point where like my rose-colored glasses of it have come off. But I think that my like argument to myself would be it's a good thing, because they haven't come off to where I'm now like, I just think like you want to see the world for as it is. It's just sometimes you do sometimes like want to be in the Matrix because it's just easier there, even though like that's bad and you shouldn't ever want to be it. Like there is like a time where you're like, sometimes I just wish I thought everything was wonderful and great. But the reality is I do want to know the reality.
And we were talking exactly about that. We were talking about the whole red pill, blue pill thing the other day. I would say that we are probably entering that phase, when you first go away to college and you're, well, this contradicts what I was saying earlier, because I felt like the Korean culture and society was entering the tweener age, but I think we're actually entering the college era where you're first away from home, you're first learning to think critically, you start taking classes where they actually challenge you in a true sense, unlike high school classes, which are mostly rote memorization, and you just have to have these fundamentals in order for you to get to college and getting accepted into college and so forth. I want to be able to say that the Korean dramas that are coming down the pipeline are going to be the ones that truly spread their wings and can actually make a difference, the way that a movie like Parasite or or Past Lives have done. I haven't really seen that in the last couple of years. I think there were more of those during the mid-teens, like you were mentioning earlier. But I'm optimistic, cautiously.
Yeah, and it's made me want to like be more scholarly and thoughtful of just kind of like the content as well, because sometimes I just want to like passively consume and not think. So yeah, conversations like these do make me want to be like more kind of thinking of, I'm never going to be academic. I don't like being academic. I'm actually like I'm not anti-academic. I'm just not. I just know I'm not an academic. I definitely come from like a commercial space perspective, but you can be smart within you can attempt to be smart within a commercial space perspective.
I think you can have a critical lens without being academic. I think the fine line for me is going to be the flip side of that, which is I have to feel a little less personally invested.
Yeah, which is, I think you have like a unique lens on that, because there's like a lot of things that are going to be like intersectional for you, and like having, even like you said, talking about like family or your past or your life, it's very, it hits different.
And it's not to say that I identify more with the Korean side of my identity versus my side, because I have very similar feelings about what's coming out of our culture as well. And I don't know if you watched the VMAs the other day, for example, and I was like, really?
Oh yeah, be good. We'll have to talk about that as a sidebar at some point too, because I'm really into with it, and some I'm like, yeah, not sure. But this is again where like that's and there's also like the generational cycles and like what's speaking to.
Yeah, there is that as well.
So, okay, well, this was a really fun and kind of all over the place, like uncensored-ish episode, but I hope that people who hung in there enjoyed it. I certainly enjoy talking to you, and I would love to have you back and talk more. So yeah, thank you.
I would love to come back, but I appreciate your having me on and allowing me to free associate. I feel like in some sense it was a little bit like a Rorschach test.
That is what we do. Well, thank you very much. And I feel even like cheesy saying like at the end, we always say annyeong, but you are welcome to take part in our close off sign off.
I'd love to say that.
So annyeong.
Okay, annyeong.
감사합니다. Thank you for listening to Afternoona Delight. Where can you find us outside the pod? Head on over to afternoonadelight.com. That's AFTERNOONADELIGHT.com. You'll find links to all our social media, our book recs, K-pop and K-skincare recs, and if you want even more Afternoona Delight, because really who doesn't, you can join our Patreon, where you can choose the patron level that's right for you. Join in daily K-drama conversations, listen to bonus podcast episodes just for patrons, and participate in our monthly live K-drama support group via Zoom. We can't wait for you to be a part of the community. Until next time, annyeong!